Today we're going to be visiting the Château de Langeais in the Loire Valley of France. This place once hosted a secret wedding that shocked Europe, changed history, and altered the map of France forever. It also set in motion the chain of events that would culminate in a French dynastic crisis and would end with the ascension of France's Renaissance king François Ier. That wedding also caused spin-off events that would intertwine the strands of English royal history and Reformation history. The final twist in this story ends with a secret and scandalously dangerous royal marriage that caused England's King Henry VIII to lose his royal temper with his beloved sister and his best friend. And if you know your Renaissance history, we'll also see early peaks of Anne Boleyn's entrance onto the world stage. And it was all due to a 14-year-old girl marrying the King of France here at Langeais. Come along with us as we walk through this historic place, and I will try to tell you all the dramatic and intertwined personal stories that began with this wedding. The original fortress here was founded by the Count of Anjou in 992. It was built on a promontory to guard the access from the Loire River below. He built the now ruined stone keep that you can see here at the back of the property, and what remains of it is one of the earliest datable examples of a stone keep anywhere. You can see that right there. Amazing. That original fortress changed hands many times over the years, eventually being in the hands of King Richard the Lionheart, who expanded and fortified the castle here. It was eventually taken from the English by Philip II of France in 1206. Langeais was then rebuilt in 1465 by Louis XI. But our story really begins with one of my favorite women in history, Anne of Brittany. Her father, the Duke of Brittany, died in 1488, leaving Anne the sole heir to the duchy at the age of around 11 years old. Unable to rule or keep Brittany safe and independent at such a young age, Anne was married by proxy in 1490 to Maximillian I of Austria, who would later become the Holy Roman Emperor. The hope was that he would be true to his word and send help to protect from neighboring France, whose King Charles VIII kept invading in the hope of making Brittany part of France. Anne was to be disappointed in her marriage to Maximilian. Help never came, and neither did he. As far as we know, they never met. And in fact, Charles increased his assaults on Brittany, which brings us to the dawn hours of December 6th of 1491. To maintain peace with France and to keep her beloved Breton people safe from further war and destruction, the 14-year-old Anne was forced to annul her marriage to Maximilian and marry Charles VIII, the King of France. That took place in the Great Hall here at Langeais. This would cost her greatly, as her beloved duchy's independence was gone forever as Brittany was absorbed into Greater France. Her status as sole ruler of Brittany also disappeared as Charles took over the rulership of the duchy. You can still see her motto in this room that says "Death before dishonor," and her emblems of the ermine tail and the fleur-de-lis of France are obvious in the floor here and all throughout the castle. I always love looking for the emblems of the rulers of France in any of the chateaus we visit. And here is where the story begins to get complicated. In an odd twist of fate, Charles himself was not actually free to marry Anne at the time, as he had been betrothed since 1483 to marry Margaret of Austria, who was actually Maximilian's young daughter. Margaret had been sent at a young age to be raised in France and trained for her future as the Queen of France. In 1491, Charles broke off the engagement when he married Anne, so he was basically marrying Margaret's stepmother. So at this point we have Anne annulling her marriage to Maximilian in order to marry his daughter's betrothed. Margaret actually wasn't returned to her family until 1493, but we will see her re-enter the story in a major way later on. She is another amazing woman in Renaissance history and well worth reading up on. Obviously, this must have been all quite a slap in the face to Maximilian, as he lost his marriage and his daughter's betrothal while the two involved married each other. He protested this annulment to the Pope, and when Charles VIII also asked for a dispensation for his marriage to Anne, the same Pope would only grant it if Anne stood before an ecclesiastical court and vowed that she hadn't been forced into the marriage and had suffered no violence. And right here you can see another example of her beautiful emblem of the ermine tail on this wall. With their marriage began a long dynastic crisis. Anne and Charles VIII had no surviving children. Their only son to survive infancy, Charles Orlando, died around the age of 3 from smallpox on their wedding anniversary, December 6th. At this point, Charles VIII's only heir apparent remained his cousin and brother-in-law, Louis d'Orléans, who had been forced to marry Charles's sister, Jeanne, who was known as Joan the Lame. In a rather wicked royal twist, their marriage had been arranged specifically by her father because she was deformed and thought to be sterile, and her father, King Louis XI, hoped to eliminate any heirs from Louis' Orléans branch of the Valois family. When Charles VIII died suddenly at the age of 28 in 1498, after hitting his head running under a low doorway at the nearby Château d'Amboise on his way to a tennis match, history changed yet again. You can see Anne and Charles's marriage ceremony in highly detailed wax figures here in this great hall, narrated by France's terrific documentarian, Stéphane Bern. You can sit on a bench right here and follow the whole story. It was a really cool room to just take a break and enjoy this show. Part of Anne and Charles's marriage contract had stipulated that if Charles died childless, the widowed Anne would agree to then marry the next king of France, who turned out to be Louis XII. And as is the case with many royal marriages of the time, a prior marriage was not always an impediment to the next marriage. Louis quickly annulled his prior marriage to Jeanne and married her and his sister-in-law, the widowed Queen Anne. Must have been an interesting Christmas dinner for this group. Even I had to stop and double-check my facts here. Anne and Louis' marriage was said to have become a loving one, although still no sons came to inherit the crown of France. Anne and Louis had two daughters, Claude and Renee, neither of whom could inherit the French throne, and Louis' heir apparent was François d'Angoulême, the son of the forceful Louise de Savoy, who had long believed that her precious son was destined to be king. After Anne died January 9th of 1514, probably from kidney stones at the age of 36, at the Château de Blois in the Loire Valley, their elder daughter Claude was married to François d'Angoulême, who we met earlier, so that at least their daughter Claude would still be queen, if Louis still continued to have no sons. Louis was said to be devastated at the loss of Queen Anne, but he did still want to have his own son follow him to the throne, and here we begin to weave in the strands of English history. If you recall Margaret of Austria, the sad little betrothed daughter who was sent home to Maximillian when her betrothal was broken to Charles, she went on to become the regent of the Habsburg Netherlands, and it was to her court that the English ambassador to France, one Thomas Boleyn, sent his young daughter Anne, who would spend about a year and a half at the court of Margaret of Austria. Back in France, after Queen Anne of Brittany's death, and still hoping for an heir, the 52-year-old Louis XII signed a peace treaty with England's Henry VIII, sealing it by marrying Henry's 18-year-old sister, the beautiful Mary Tudor, on October 9th of 1514. Said to have been worn out from trying to keep up with the lifestyle and his vivacious new wife, Louis died on January 1st of 1515. The young widow Mary was sent for 40 days of seclusion at Paris's Hôtel de Cluny to see whether or not she carried an heir for France, which she did not. And here we have the second royal scandal, because as the story goes, when Henry sent his sister to France to marry Louis, Mary made him promise that if she outlived Louis, she would be free to choose her next husband herself. Apparently there may have been some sort of romantic attachment or relationship before this time between Mary and Henry's longtime best friend, Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk. And it was this same Charles who arrived in France after Louis's death to escort Mary home after her seclusion ended. However, this couple secretly married at the Cluny with Francois's permission on March 3rd of 1515, causing a royal bombshell of a scandal back home. Mary's brother Henry VIII was enraged at both his sister and his best friend, as it was considered treason to marry a royal princess, meaning Charles was risking his head by doing this, and it was absolutely illegal for a royal princess to marry without permission. Henry eventually allowed them to return to England, and he did provide them with a second formal marriage ceremony, but he fined them heavily, demanding repayment of her £200,000 dowry, plus a £24,000 fine, which amounts to about £7.2 million in today's money, payable at £1,000 a year. Plus, they had to return all jewels and gifts she had received during her brief marriage. She is said to specifically have gifted her brother Henry, though, with the fabulous jewel called the Mirror of Naples at this time, which was, I believe, a diamond with like a pendant pearl the size of a pigeon's egg, and I believe that has been lost to history somewhere. The horrendous fines were later reduced by Henry, and they were restored to royal favor, but what a heavy price to pay. At this point, Louise of Savoy's dreams came true, and her beloved son Francois became France's famed Renaissance king, Francois I, with Anne and Louis' daughter Claude as his queen. It is also at this point in time that we see peaks of Anne and her sister Mary Boleyn entering the world stage, as they served at the French royal court around this time. Mary Boleyn is believed to have been sent as a maid-in-waiting, accompanying Mary Tudor on her arrival to France to marry King Louis in 1514. And Anne Boleyn was transferred to the French court after her time with Margaret of Austria. It is interesting to note, though, that Anne Boleyn would have been present and witness to Charles Brandon's sort of indecent advances toward Margaret of Austria during his time in the Netherlands. This could be the basis for Mary Tudor's intense dislike of Anne Boleyn, especially when she later became queen to Henry VIII. Mary would detest her so much that she would rarely come to court during Anne's queenship. While you're here, if you love medieval tapestries, you might be surprised to find that Langeais has an incredible room called the Hall of Worthies, which holds a stunning set of 15th century tapestries, each one representing one of the 9 worthies, men of history and legend who would have been well known as chivalric heroes of the medieval age. Here you can walk through and look at each one of these in close detail if you'd like. It's fairly dark, but you will see beautiful details. You'll see 3 biblical heroes, Joshua, King David, and Judas Maccabee. You will see 3 heroes from antiquity, Hector, Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar, and 3 heroes from more of the Middle Ages legends, King Arthur, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Charlemagne. Definitely do not skip this room unless you're just not into tapestries. I am very into tapestries, and I found this just absolutely a treasure to find this amazing room. And you can walk through the little outer walkway here and get a glimpse of graffiti down through the ages. Some of them are marked with this little leaf here, or an eye, it looks like an eye or a leaf, that points out specific ones that are historically important, that were made by people down through the ages. Continuing with our threads of history down through this time period, for any of my Tudor history fans, this period in France gives us some terrific insight into the development of what would become Anne Boleyn's politically outspoken nature, the evangelical faith that she would bring to England as Henry's queen, and her well-known French style. Her formative years here were spent in the company of powerful women at the heart of Europe's politics, such as Margaret of Austria, the regent of the Netherlands, the forceful power behind the French throne, Francois I's mother, Louise of Savoy, and Francois' progressive and Protestant sister, Margarite of Navarre, who was well known as a Renaissance author and supporter of the Reformation sweeping through Europe. Marguerite earned the title of the first modern woman, so we can really see why Anne was never going to be a meek and mild queen smiling in the background of history. Anne would go on to serve as a maid-in-waiting in Queen Claude's pious household here in France until she was recalled to England around 1521 when she burst onto the stage there, which is a story for another video. Anne would have been very familiar with the Loire Valley, as Claude spent much of her reign moving around the Château of the region, especially nearby Blois and Amboise. We can only wonder if Anne stayed here herself at Langeais. Claude sadly died in 1524 at the age of 24 after having given birth to 7 children in just 9 years. Looking at all of the things that came to be following that wedding in 1491 of Anne and King Charles, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch, I don't think, to say that Langeais is one of the most important castles you could visit in French history. If you're visiting here, it's about a half an hour west of Tours, where we were staying. It's also maybe 10 to 15 minutes from both Azay-le-Rideau and the beautiful gardens at Villandry, so this would make a terrific afternoon stop after visiting one of those other chateaux. And even if you're not a giant fan of history, Langeais is terrific because it is full of medieval period furnishings. It's got 16 rooms that are beautifully decorated. You can wander through. It was lovingly restored at the end of the 1800s with all of the furnishings that you see here, and then donated to the Institut de France, who owns it now. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.